On an October night in 1983, three silent farm men walked away from a peeling white house on Old Jackson Road and slipped into dark Georgia fields. By sunrise, 12 neighbors lay dead across 2 square miles of peanut rows, pasture, and barbed wire. All of them kin by blood or marriage, all shot at close range, most found right on a fence line. The killers were the Cooper men, led by Wade Lee Cooper, moving along the boundary like a small war squad. The sheriff later called it the worst farm massacre the county had ever seen. Folks said it started over a broken fence and a wandering calf. They were wrong. Under one split cedar post lay a clean mason jar and a folded paper with a single family name. What vanished before that night was not cattle or cash, but an old whiskey recipe tied to honor and blood. If you can bear this story, stay with me, hit subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Sirens had barely reached Old Jackson Road when the call first hit the county radio. In town, 5 miles away, Elkhorn still looked calm. A few trucks rolled past the feed store. A school bus idled in front of the brick high school. Folks waking up had no idea 12 bodies lay in the fields. Inside the low, square sheriff's office, dust hung in the air like a thin veil. The place sat between the courthouse and a tire shop, paint peeling from the trim, flag rope slapping a dull beat in the weak light. Sheriff Earl McDaniel walked in with his hat in his hand and the night's coffee still sitting in his gut. Across the front wall stretched a big county map, lines in red wax pencil marking property lines, dirt roads, and old still sites. Thumbtacks showed trouble spots, a logging fight here, a dope raid there, more and more pills each year. Beside the map hung black and white photos of seized copper coils and busted barrels. Down a narrow hall, behind a barred door, the evidence room smelled like cardboard, metal, and old corn mash. Shelves held tagged jars, rusted still pieces, shotguns, and a milk crate full of ledgers taken from past raids. On many of those tags sat the same 2 names written in fading ink: Cooper, Hargrove. In that town, farming paid the daylight bills when it paid at all. Peanuts, cotton, soybeans, a little cattle here and there. Prices rose and fell somewhere far away, and the men in Elkhorn just tried to hang on. A bad rain at the wrong time could mean no new tractor tire, no school shoes, no visit to a doctor 2 counties over. So a lot of folks cooked liquor in the gaps. A string of hidden stills along the creeks and low spots made the money that kept power on and kept banks away from front doors. It wasn't a rich man's game. It was side cash to cover seed, feed, gas, and what pride wouldn't let a man beg for. Sheriff Earl knew that better than anyone. His own uncles had run whiskey before the war. He'd poured jars out on the ground in front yards, then sat on those same porches and drank sweet tea with the men he'd just fined. To him, it was wrong because the law said so, but it lived close to the bone of the place. On a corkboard near his desk, past arrest sheets curled at the edges. One slip listed Wade L. Cooper and Vern Hargrove side by side from a raid years back, a simple fine for untaxed alcohol. Another showed a fence complaint between the same men, closed with a handwritten note, "Talked it out, no charges." Red ink circled those names now. At the dispatch desk, Ruth Ann Miller put on her headset and flipped through call logs. She was kin to Cooper's on her daddy's side and tied to Hargrove's through an old marriage. Her voice went out over the whole county, even while she paid her own light bill late. That morning, she heard the first panicked report. Shots, screaming, somewhere by the cedar. A fresh deputy leaned toward Earl's office door and said, "You want me to pull the old files on those 2?" His voice cracked a little on the last word. Earl rubbed his temple and nodded once. "Yeah, all of it. Every time they've crossed this line." What sat in those folders told a long story in short, dry words. Fence cuts, stray cattle, odd trucks up back roads late at night, quiet warnings. Each line had seemed small on the day it was written. Added up, they painted a county where pride, land, and side money had been rubbing hard for years. Out in the fields, Wade Cooper still stood under the split cedar. Back in town, the machines of law were just starting to wake up. To grasp why one man would choose his own code over every badge in that office, you have to see this pressure cooker of low crops, easy liquor, and thin law. In a place like Elkhorn, paper and tags tried to hold order. For some men, that was never going to be enough. That truth started in Wade Cooper's kitchen, long before the sirens and the blue lights. His day always began there, in the gray hour when the rooster was still thinking about it. The room was narrow, with faded yellow paint and a table scarred by knives, jars, and years of elbows. Coffee hissed on the stove. Wade's boots were already laced. His back ached when he straightened, but he moved like a man who had made peace with pain a long time ago. Old combat scars and farm strain had carved lines into him. Nothing soft remained, yet nothing in him rushed. On the far wall sat a small metal box, bolted into the studs behind a calendar from the feed store. Only Wade had the key. Inside lay a single stained card, edges slick with years of thumb oil. On it, in his grandfather's hand, sat the mash recipe that had carried Cooper's through bad seasons and 2 wars. Most folks in Elkhorn saw jars as just cash. To Wade, every clear bottle on his pantry shelf was a record of his people. His great-granddaddy had run the creek stills with mules. His father had cooked corn through the worst of the lean times. The card was what tied Wade to all of that. If he lost land, he could still cook. If he lost machines, he could still cook. If he lost that card, he lost his place in the line. Eli, the older son, came in first, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He was broad in the shoulders like Wade, quieter than most boys his age. Joel followed quicker, always bouncing a little like he had more electricity than the house could hold. "You two eat," Wade said, sliding plates in front of them. His voice stayed low, even when he wanted to shout. "Then we'll pull jars." Joel glanced at the calendar, at the edge of metal peeking out from behind it. "You ever gonna let us see what's in there?" he asked, halfway to mouth. Wade's gaze cut over, steady. "You know what's in there. You don't need to see it to respect it." Eli looked at the pantry instead. On its shelves sat rows of clear mason jars lined up like soldiers. Each had a strip of paper under the ring, date, batch number, a tiny mark in one corner. That mark was Wade's private sign, the same on every jar he let leave the house. He kept a notebook too, one no one else touched. In it he wrote where each jar went. 6 to Vern, fence work. 2 to Earl's cousin, tire trade. 4 to church roof fund, quiet. His handwriting was small and neat. Years later, an investigator would open that book and see more than numbers. He would see a man who turned every favor and deal into a line on a page. After breakfast, Wade stepped into the cool pantry. He lifted a jar, turned it toward the bare bulb, and watched the light slice through it. No cloud, no swirl. A good run. He set it down and ran his thumb along the label. In his mind, jars weren't just drink. They were proof that he'd worked, that he'd kept the line going, that his name still meant something. His wife Marie watched from the doorway, arms crossed over her apron. "You act like that card loves you back," she said once, not unkind, but tired. "It ain't about love, it's about what's left when I'm gone." Even when he was quiet, his mind measured and marked. Landlines, who owed what, who knew how much. The same part of him that had counted paces in jungle clearings now counted fence posts and creek bends. On paper, he tracked only jars. In his head, he tracked people. From that small room, he could see the whole web, where his whiskey went, which names stayed loyal, which ones talked too loud at the station. That was his hidden skill, the thing most folks missed. They saw a worn farmer. They didn't see the man building a careful record of every handshake tied to that old recipe. In the end, the killings would turn those habits into weapons. Before gunfire ever cracked over the fields, though, it was just Wade, a locked box, a card, and a shelf of glass waiting to carry his name a little farther down the line. Out beyond that pantry and locked box, another man was looking at clear liquor in a different light. Where Wade saw line and duty, Vernon Hargrove saw a way out of a hole he'd been sliding into for years. Dust hung over the cotton gin like chalk fog. Belts squealed, metal clanged, and trailers inched forward under the old conveyor. Vern's pickup sat off to the side, backed up near the loading dock, tailgate down, cooler in the back. He leaned there in his ball cap, boots crossed, smiling easy at any man who walked by. "Try this one," he told a driver, passing over a cold mason jar. "My new blend, Hargrove White, smooth as a lie from a banker." The men laughed. Jar lids popped. A few deep swallows later, they nodded with wide eyes. "That's good," one said. "Real good. Ought to bottle that for real." Vern soaked praise like dry dirt soaks rain. To the crowd, he was just Vern. Funny, quick, always ready to help patch a roof or pull a stuck truck from a ditch. Nobody saw the second face he kept turned toward bills and banks and a wife sitting at the kitchen table crying over checks. In the glove box of that truck, under oil-stained receipts and a church program, lay a thin manila folder. Inside it sat a typed draft contract from a small liquor outfit up near Atlanta. The company letterhead spoke of heritage branding and authentic Southern craft. To secure the deal, Vern had promised a family mash recipe that he personally developed. His new blend was nothing new. It was Cooper mash, learned beside a creek still on cool fall evenings. Wade had shown him piece by piece, not from the card, but from the steps. How hot to fire, how slow to drip, when to toss the heads, how clear shine ought to smell when it first hit your lip. At first, the sharing had felt right. Two men watching each other's backs. Vern had cut fence, fixed pumps, and hauled feed when Wade's back went out. In return, Wade had given him jars, then small lessons, then more. "You're the only one outside blood I'm showing this to," Wade had said once, looking him in the eye. That line stuck with Vern, not as a warning, as a reason to think the recipe partly his. In the truck bed, a crate of jars clinked when the wind hit. Each wore a fresh label with a printed name, Hargrove. Vern had started scratching off Wade's old tiny corner mark and replacing it with his own scrawl, just different enough to pass. His oldest boy, Dale, hopped up on the bumper. "Daddy, you really gonna sell this in stores?" he asked, eyes bright. "That's the plan," Vern replied. "Gonna get us out from under these folks." He jerked his chin toward the bank downtown, though the building wasn't in sight. "You, your mama, your brother, you all deserve better than scrapping every month." In his mind, the math made sense. He and Wade had been partners for years. He'd hauled, he'd sat up nights, he'd taken risk. The mash was old, sure, but you couldn't patent what your granddaddy did in a rusty pot. If somebody was going to turn it into real money, why not the man willing to push it further? He told himself Wade would be fine. "That old man don't even want to expand," Vern muttered once in the cab, staring at the contract. "He just wants to sit on that card till he dies." Saying it like that made his choice feel less like theft, more like needed progress. By late summer, he had taught the key parts of the method to his own clan. 2 sons, a cousin over on the next road, an in-law who ran a bar in town. Each new set of hands was another leak in what had once been a tight Cooper circle. Under the gin's metal roof, jar after jar left his cooler and passed between calloused hands. Men walked away talking about Hargrove White, rolling the words on their tongues the way they'd once said Cooper Shine. If Wade Cooper's pantry was the quiet heart of an old code, this dusty gin lot was where that code started to crack. Here, in the rattle of belts and the easy swing of Vern's charm, the Cooper mash became a thing with a price tag and a catchy name. Vern did not fire a shot. He only smiled, poured, and signed his name on a promise that would cost 12 folks their lives. By the time folks were bragging on Hargrove White more than they ever spoke the Cooper name, Wade felt like the ground had tipped under his boots. At the co-op, a man pushed a jar into his hand and said Vern had finally got it right. Wade raised it, smelled once, and knew at once it was his own mash. He carried that knowledge home like a stone in his chest. After the boys turned in and the house got quiet, he stepped into the small bedroom he shared with Marie and shut the door. The fan in the hall clacked slow. Moonlight edged the window. Wade sat at the old desk and pulled his notebook closer. On a blank page, he printed a single word at the top: names. Under it, he listed Vern, then Vern's sons, Dale and Mike. Next went Cousin Ray on the next road, then Tommy Lee at the bar. Beside each one, he marked a small sign only he would understand: a check for taught, a circle for helped, a question mark for sat close. When the first line filled, he turned the page sideways and began a sketch. Old Jackson Road down the middle, his own acres shaded one way, Hargrove land shaded another. Little squares for houses, little dots for barns, arrows for the paths men walked in the dark. Fence lines ran like scars across the paper. Marie came in carrying a basket of folded shirts. She paused behind him, looked over his shoulder, and saw the map, the names, the tight letters. For a long moment she said nothing. The only sound was the soft scrape of Wade's pen. "You plannin' beans or trouble?" she asked at last, setting the basket down on the bed. "Plannin' what's real," he answered, without turning. He reached under the desk and pulled out a thin envelope. Inside lay a yellowed notice from years before, when the county had fined him and Vern together for untaxed liquor. Their names stood side by side on that paper, tied under one case number. Marie moved closer. "You could take this to Earl, tell him Vern's running your mash under his own name, let the law sort it." Wade stared at the old notice a beat, then slid it back. "Law counts gallons, counts guns, still pots, taxes. It don't have a line for a man stealing another man's blood work. You show them this, they'll shrug and say that's between y'all." The thought of walking into the sheriff's office, hand in house, to argue over a recipe card sounded as bad as not fighting at all. The old men he'd grown up around had settled insults with fists, not forms. He pushed aside the notebook and brought out a metal cash box from under the bed. Inside lay loan papers, tax stubs, and a copy of the deed that first gave Coopers a slice of ground along Old Jackson Road. He spread the deed flat and traced the line where his fence met Hargrove pasture. "That's where he crossed, first with cattle, now with my name," Wade said softly. Marie watched his finger ride that ink road. "You got 2 boys sleeping down the hall," she reminded him. "They need you more than that card in the wall does. Don't go doing something they can't outrun." He heard her, but her words landed on the same hard rock that had carried him through war and bad years. In his mind, the choice was already narrowed: stand by while another man wore his legacy like a coat, or answer it in the old way, on the ground where the slight had been done. That was his misjudgment right there in that small room. He never truly considered lawyers, contracts, or simply walking away and starting fresh with something new. His thinking locked around fences, blood, and the idea that some wrongs only counted if you met them yourself. So he made a quiet pact with the paper in front of him. Every name he'd written who carried the stolen mash in their line, every hand that helped Vern spread it, would be accounted for. If there was no place in the courthouse books for what he'd lost, he would write his own record along those wire lines. When Wade capped his pen, the page held more than notes. It held the first shape of a death map. The men on it still joked with him at the store and waved from tractors in the dust. None of them knew that in Wade's careful, wounded mind, they'd already stepped across a line he no longer meant to leave unguarded. The paper map on Wade's desk turned into a picture in his mind. Every time he stepped out his door, he could see it laid over the dirt and pavement. Names, houses, fence lines like thin scars. Once he drew it, he couldn't unsee it. A few days later, the first real crack showed in public. Late afternoon heat sat heavy on the county road when Eli and Joel pulled into the gas station with the old pickup. The pumps clicked slow. Gnats floated in the haze above the asphalt. A cooler full of ice and glass clinked under the shade of the station's tin awning. Vern Hargrove stood right beside it, hat tipped back, one boot heel hooked on the bumper of his truck. A small crowd of farm men and hired hands leaned close, jars in hand. They laughed big and easy, the way people do when they feel like they're near the center of something new. Joel stepped out with the fuel cap in his fist and stopped. He knew that smell. Sharp, clean, corn and metal. It drifted from the open jars like a ghost of his father's pantry. "Is that his?" Eli asked, keeping his voice low. "Yeah," Joel muttered. "Only it ain't his to give." They watched from behind the pump while Vern handed a fresh jar to a man from the next county. "That's Hargrove's white. Ain't nothing like it round here. Got the process down to a science." The man took a long drink, winced, then grinned. "You could make a killing with this. Heard you got some Atlanta folks sniffing around." Vern puffed his chest a little. "We're talking. This ain't creek bottom stuff anymore. This is brand name." Each word felt like a twist of wire to Joel. He'd spent cold mornings and hot nights carrying buckets for those runs, watching his daddy sniff the first drip, throw out bad shine, keep only the clean heart. Now here stood Vern, selling those same hours as his own genius. A couple of the men noticed Eli and Joel. One lifted his jar toward them. "You boys tried this yet?" he called. "Vern's got his own line now, smooth as it comes." Eli shook his head once, he answered. His jaw worked, but he kept the rest of his face flat. He could already picture what this scene would do when it reached Wade's ears. Behind the cooler, Vern popped the lid on another jar and poured a splash onto the concrete. "For the ground that raised us," he joked, "and for fences that keep what's ours where it belongs." The men laughed again. Someone clapped him on the back. That word, fences, caught Joel like a hook. He thought of the nights Wade had patched their own wire, cursing under his breath when he found a cut strand near Harland land. He thought of the little calf Wade had lost the year before when it wandered through a gap and got tangled in old junk on the other side. By the time the tank was full, Joel's ears burned. He slammed the pump handle down harder than he meant to. Vern glanced over, eyes meeting his for a second. There was a flicker there. Guilt or worry or just awareness, but it vanished quick, covered by that easy smile. "Afternoon, boys," Vern called. "Y'all tell your daddy I said hey." Eli gave a stiff nod. Joel didn't say a word. The ride home was quiet except for the hum of the road and the rattle in the dashboard. When they pulled into the Cooper yard, Wade was sitting on the porch step, boot knife in hand, whittling a strip of wood into curls. He looked up once, reading their faces the way he read weather. "What'd you see?" he asked. Joel told it plain. The jars, the jokes, the talk about deals up near Atlanta. Each detail stacked on the next. Wade listened without cutting in, the knife slowing in his hand. He poured some out, Joel finished. Said it was for fences keeping what's ours on their side. The blade stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was a dog barking far off and the cicadas starting up in the trees. That was the first real clash, though no punch was thrown and no shot fired. In front of half the county, Vern had taken Wade's legacy, stamped his own name on it, and tied it to the very idea of borders and ownership. He'd stood on ground where Wade bought gas, sent his sons, and made himself the man folks thanked for good liquor. Inside Wade, something settled. This wasn't just quiet theft now, it was open replacement. Out on Old Jackson Road, 2 square miles of fields and fences suddenly felt too small for both of their names to stand. He put the knife away, stood up slow, and walked inside. The map in his notebook no longer felt like a bad thought he might tear up and forget. It felt like the start of a plan he meant to finish. Wade stepped inside, door soft behind him. The house smelled of grease and smoke. Marie turned from the sink when she heard his boots, but he didn't stop to talk. Eli and Joel sat quiet at the table, hands on plates. Wade went past them down the short hall, into the bedroom where the desk and notebook waited. Light from the small window fell across the map he'd drawn. Old Jackson Road, his acres, Hargrove acres, little marks for each house. Joel's story about the gas station ran through his thoughts. Every brag about Hargrove White. He sat, picked up his pen, and drew a hard cross beside Vern's name. In Wade's private code, that mark meant line crossed, grace used. Work went on through that evening and into morning. He fed cattle, checked fences, tried to keep his face plain. The strain finally rose the next hot afternoon when he saw fresh sagging wire along the cedar stretch and spotted 3 Hargrove cows chewing in his peanut rows. Dirt stuck to his sweat as he walked there with hammer and new barbed wire. Halfway down the run, a truck door slammed on the far side. Vern's cousin Ray stepped out, rifle hanging in the back glass. "Your cows are over," Wade said, pointing with the hammer. Ray shrugged. "Fence was weak. They wander." Voices sharpened. Both men edged closer to the wire, stubborn pride flaring. Then Ray's hand slid toward the rifle stock. One sharp shot cracked across the quiet field. Birds jumped from the hedgerow. Ray dropped in the dirt, grabbing his thigh and yelling. Wade stood over the line with his pistol still warm, chest tight. For a few heartbeats, he stared at Ray's face and thought about another shot. Instead, he turned, walked to his truck, and drove away. 2 houses down, a neighbor woman had been hanging sheets on a sagging rope. She saw Ray fall and heard him shout. The sheet slipped from her hands. She ran inside, snatched the wall phone, and punched 3 numbers. In the small dispatch room in town, a green light came on over Ruth Ann Miller's station. "911, what's your emergency?" Ruth asked, headset on. The woman spilled words between sobs. Fence, guns, Wade Cooper, Ray Hargrove, lots of blood. Ruth wrote the names and location on her pad. Those surnames, both tied into her own family lines, made her stomach knot. She had eaten at both kitchen tables since she was a girl. She routed the call to a deputy and radioed the sheriff. Possible shooting, Old Jackson by the cedar stretch. 1 hit, still talking. Earl's answer came steady over the speaker. He ordered an ambulance and muttered that it was probably another hot weather fence argument. The deputy reached the scene to find Wade gone and Ray cussing in the dirt. By evening, the clinic chart said gunshot wound, thigh, and the sheriff report called it land dispute, non-fatal firearm. Ruth typed those words into the old terminal and saved the file. Her fingers hovered over the keys. For a second, she thought about calling Marie at home, asking what lay under all this, then stopped herself. Policy and fear held her quiet. Out on Old Jackson Road, Wade sat at his kitchen table, gun cleaned. He knew the call had gone through and could already picture the short line in the log. Just another fence fight. He opened his own notebook and wrote under Vern's name. That page, neat and private, felt like the only record that would ever tell what this meant. When Wade closed the notebook that night, the house had gone still. Crickets sang through the thin walls. Marie lay on her side in bed, back turned, eyes open in the dark. She knew when his pen scratched late, trouble was circling, but she didn't ask. Out in the yard, the cattle settled. On his map, a fresh mark sat beside Ray's name. Days slid by in a heat haze. Folks talked about the shooting at the fence, said Ray should have kept his hands away from that rifle, said Wade had always been too tight about lines. No one bled out, so the story never got bigger than porch talk. The county moved on toward Sunday, like it always did. Pine Ridge Baptist sat 3 miles down Old Jackson Road, white paint flaking, steeple leaning a little toward the pines. On the first Sunday after the fence shot, the fellowship hall below the sanctuary filled with voices and food. Long folding tables bowed under tin pans, bowls and plates brought in from every kitchen in the area. Steam rolled off macaroni, beans, and roast. Children ran between legs with paper cups of sweet tea. Old women hovered over pies. Ceiling fans pushed the hot air around. At one end of the hall, near the back door, a smaller table held a row of clear jars. No labels, just lids and a strip of masking tape with a single word, in marker, Hargrove. Vern stood near them, laughing at something the pastor said. His sons, Dale and Mike, carried cups back and forth, pouring a little into coffee mugs for some of the older men. It was just a taste, they said, nothing strong, just enough to wet tongues and start talk about good times. Wade came in late, hat in hand, Marie by his side, boys trailing. He did not walk near the jar table. He nodded to a few faces, sat at the far end of a bench, and stared at his plate. His eyes, though, tracked every move in the room. Across from him, a pair of gray-haired deacons bent heads over their mugs. One took a small sip, rolled it on his tongue, and raised his brows. This tastes like old Coopershine, back when Wade's daddy had that still by the creek. The other glanced toward Vern and his boys. "Well, somebody's learned a trick or two," he answered. "Maybe the old ways ain't so dead after all." Ruth Ann moved between tables with a tray of cups, helping the women serve. She caught snatches of these lines and tucked them away in the back of her mind with every other half-truth this town lived on. She knew whose name had been on old raid forms. She also knew who was now smiling over jars in church. Vern lifted his cup high at one point and called out, "To good neighbors and open lines." Laughter rippled through the hall. Dale grinned and slapped his dad's shoulder. For folks who didn't know the undercurrent, it was a harmless toast. For Wade, the words landed heavy as a stone. He watched Dale lean down and pour a splash for an uncle, then hand a dry cup to a small girl who had tagged along, telling her it was only juice. That small hand, that bright, trusting face, caught Wade off guard. The men on his map were tied to children like this, to wives lifting pans, to teens scraping plates into the trash barrel. His code had always drawn a line around women and little ones. You didn't cross it. Even in war, he'd tried to keep that straight in his head. Now, sitting in a church basement, he realized the names in his book were not lone trunks. They were whole trees with roots all through the room. For a moment, doubt pressed in. He saw one path where he burned the map, walked away, let the recipe go. Another where he went to Earl with the ledger, let judges and suits handle a thing they barely understood. Both felt wrong in his bones, but so did the vision of blood spilling across yards where these same children now played.
As he watched, a man from town in a pressed shirt and shiny belt buckle came through the side door. Not a farmer, not a cousin. Vern moved toward him fast, hand out, eyes bright. They spoke low, heads close. The stranger tapped a folder under his arm. Vern nodded toward the Hargrove jars like he was showing off a prize hog at fair. Ruth Ann saw that too. She set her tray down and pretended to fuss with a stack of napkins so she could listen. Words drifted over the clatter. Contract, next month, exclusive rights. Each said this was bigger than gossip now. It was about to step into the open world of checks, trucks, and printed bottles. Wade rose from the bench, chair legs scraping the floor. Marie put a hand on his wrist for a second, then let go. He walked out the back door into the heat, past the jar table, past Vern's sons, out to the edge of the churchyard where the grass met packed dirt. In his truck, parked nearby, a sealed envelope waited on the seat, one of the copies of his own ledger he planned to hide at the old still. He thought about taking it back inside, tearing it up, dropping the whole idea. Instead, he opened the door, slid the envelope under the seat so it wouldn't bake in plain view, and rested his hand on the worn wheel. Inside the hall, laughter swelled again. Vern's voice carried, smooth and easy. Out by the graves, Wade's jaw clenched. The map in his mind shifted, adding wives and children as shadows behind each marked name. It didn't loosen his grip on the plan. It only made the weight of what he was about to do settle deeper into his bones.
Late that Sunday, the sun was dropping behind the pines when Wade started his truck. Church voices blurred into one dull hum through the closed windows. The envelope he'd slid under the seat brushed his boot when he pressed the clutch. Dust rose behind him as he pulled onto Old Jackson Road and headed home. Back at the farm, light still leaked from the kitchen, but Wade steered past the house and rolled on toward the barn. The long tin roof caught the last of the orange sky. One by one, he killed the engine, stepped down, and let the quiet settle. Crickets, a low cow call, the faint tick of cooling metal. This was the sound of his whole world. Inside the barn, air hung thick with hay, oil, and old sweat. Tools lined the walls. Feed sacks were stacked in a leaning column. In the far corner, beside a stack of pallets, Wade had cleared a rough workspace, an old door on sawhorses, a lantern, a rag, and 3 long guns laid side by side. He set the church envelope on the door, then reached back into his jacket and pulled out 2 more, each thick with folded pages. One was marked Courthouse, the other Pine Ridge. His handwriting was steady, every letter sharp. Inside each packet sat a careful copy of his ledger. Who learned the mash, when they took it, how they spread it. On a hay bale, a small metal box sat open. It held extra rounds, a flashlight, and a worn compass from Wade's war days. He checked each shell, slid them into magazines, then placed the loaded guns on the door in order. Shortest first, heaviest last. He'd already walked the route in his head 100 times. Outside, a dog barked once, then went quiet. The sky beyond the barn door shifted from orange to deep blue. Wade blew dust off the envelopes and stacked them. Eli, you'll take the one for the courthouse. Leave it in the night drop before first light. Nobody sees you. Nobody talks to you. Eli nodded slowly. And the church one? I'll handle that. Still sight, too. Old ground ought to hear this for whatever that's worth. Joel picked the jar back in the crate, hands trembling just a little. What about the kids, the wives? They didn't steal anything. The question hung in the straw-scented air. Wade's jaw worked. He stared at the lantern flame, eyes flat.
Names in that crate are the ones that learned the mash. They're the ones this is for. I ain't pointin' steel at little ones. I ain't puttin' jars by beds, but I ain't lettin' what they did stand either. Wind rattled the barn siding. Dust motes moved through the light like slow snow. Wade picked up one of the rifles, braced the stock in his shoulder, sighted down an invisible line, and lowered it again. Every small motion, every check, every folded page was a step closer to a night that couldn't be called back. When the guns were cleaned and loaded, when each jar held its name, when each envelope was sealed, Wade closed the metal box on the credit card back in the house and turned the key. Then he came back to the barn, grabbed the crate and the guns, and stood in the doorway with his sons behind him. Dark had settled over Old Jackson Road. A thin, pale stripe still glowed low in the west. Somewhere out past the cedar fence, Vern's porch light burned. Wade stepped down from the threshold, boots hitting packed earth, and walked toward the truck. By morning, the map in his notebook would be written in bodies and glass instead of ink.
He was right about the morning. As gray light slid over Old Jackson Road, red and blue flashes bounced off barn tin and kitchen windows. By then, the shots had gone quiet. What remained were sirens, radios, and the slow work of picking up the dead. Ambulances and deputies' cars crawled the same fence lines Wade had traced in his notebook. They moved from the Hargrove place to Ray's, then to another cousin's farm, following tire tracks and fresh footprints in the dirt. At each stop, they found almost the same thing: a man down near a boundary, blood soaking dust or grass, a rifle or shotgun not far from his hand. At two of the scenes, a clear mason jar sat close by, glass streaked with dew, a folded white slip tucked inside. The first deputy who saw one squinted, wiped his palm on his pants, and reached down like he expected it to bite. He turned the jar in his hand, saw the paper, and swore under his breath. By mid-morning, bodies began to roll through the back door of the county morgue. The building sat behind the small brick hospital, low and square, its walls the color of old chalk. A buzzing light over the loading bay threw a sickly glow on the gurneys as attendants pushed them inside. Dr. Lionel Hayes, the county medical examiner, had worked there long enough to know the usual rhythm: car wrecks, work mishaps, the quiet dead from the nursing home on the hill. He'd never seen a line like this, sheet after sheet, tag after tag. He peeled back the first one: adult male, mid-40s, gunshot wound to the chest, soil and crushed peanut vines stuck to his boots. "Where'd they pull him from?" Hayes asked. "Back of the Hargrove place," the attendant replied, "right on the fence." The next sheet hit a younger man, maybe early 20s, entry wound high in the neck, same type of dirt, same faint smell of fertilizer and sweat. "He was at Ray's," came the murmur, "couple yards from the property markers." On a small side table, a cardboard evidence box already waited. Inside lay that first mason jar, tagged and bagged. Its paper slip showed a single name in tight block letters: Vern. Another jar would arrive an hour later, its slip holding a different name but the same neat hand. Hayes washed his hands, then stepped back to look at the gurneys as a set. "Are you seeing a pattern here?" Hayes asked the deputy, leaning in the doorway. The young man shifted, eyes a little wide. He said, "Same rifle looks like, .306, best we can tell from the brass. All of them found close to a fence line. And those jars. I ain't never had to tag a jar at a murder scene before." Hayes had grown up 2 counties over, on a farm not unlike these. He knew what fences meant out here. They weren't just wire and posts, they were pride drawn in metal. "Someone's sending a message," he muttered. "This isn't frenzy, this is placed." He dictated notes into a small recorder as he worked. Body 1, male, approximate age 45, single close-range rifle wound to the chest, no defensive wounds on hands. Scene report indicates body located at shared property boundary. As the hours went on, the story on his tape grew more strange and more clear at the same time. Adult males, all tied by blood or marriage, all from the same tangled cluster of farms, all dropped right where one man's ground met another's. No sign of struggle beyond the shots, no foreign footprints, no kicked-over furniture or ransacked rooms. In between exams, Hayes stepped into the hallway where a metal fan hummed against the heat. Sheriff Earl leaned against the wall with a styrofoam cup, looking older than he had the day before. "How bad?" Earl asked. Hayes rubbed his brow. 11 so far, maybe 12. They're still checking one more place. All shot pretty clean, same general weapon. And those jars, you know who writes like that? Earl had already seen Wade Cooper's neat lines on old citation forms and raid ledgers. He didn't answer right away. In his head, the map on his office wall lit up with pins along Old Jackson Road, each one now a sheet in this room. "We got Wade in custody," he said at last. "He was waiting under that cedar, gun beside him, hands up. Says he did it. Says he'll explain when it's time." Hayes glanced back at the row of covered shapes. "Looks to me like he already started explaining. He's just using bodies and glass instead of ink." Outside, a helicopter thumped over the courthouse square carrying a news crew from the city. Inside the morgue, the dead lay still, their wounds lined up like bullet points in some grim note only a handful of people could fully read. If you're still with me, you can see how this wasn't random. Someone turned those quiet fence lines into a message board, and the county, from the coroner's table to the sheriff's map, was just beginning to realize what kind of story had been nailed there in blood.
When Earl left the morgue that afternoon, heat smacked his face. He carried a thin file that held scene photos, jar tags, and Dr. Hayes's first notes. Reporters waited by the back gate, but he kept his head down and drove toward Elkhorn. Inside the slot sat a single brown envelope marked only with one word, printed small and even, "Sheriff." She set it on Earl's desk an hour later, on top of his fresh stack of reports from Old Jackson Road. He sliced the flap with a dull knife and slid out a narrow hand-copied ledger written on lined paper in neat block letters that looked just like Wade Cooper's old signatures. Each page listed names down the left and short notes down the right. When men first helped at a still, who hauled jars, who learned the mash, who shared it onward. Vern Hargrove sat at the top, then his sons, then cousins, then an in-law who ran a bar in town. Across the first page ran a title in the same careful hand, "Record of Cooper Mash as Shared and Taken." On the last page, one more line waited. "When this is found, I'll have answered these names." Earl read the book twice, jaw tight, then called the State Bureau office 2 hours north and said they needed to see what one of his prisoners had just mailed. By late afternoon, he sat across from Special Agent Leela Grant in a cool, windowed room in Atlanta, his hat on his knees while she turned the pages with gloved hands. On her desk lay blown-up color prints from the murder scenes, each one showing a fence, a body marker, and a mason jar with a name folded inside. The slips in those jars matched the names in the ledger, and the writing on them matched Wade's careful block print exactly. Leela drew a thin line on a yellow pad from Vern's name to the others, then wrote the words "recipe theft" beside it. She asked Earl to explain what that meant in a place like Elkhorn, where the law watched jars but never wrote down who owned a taste or a method. He told her about the Cooper family card, about Wade's father and grandfather, about how the recipe was the one thing that stayed when banks, prices, and seasons all turned against a man. From Wade's view, Earl said, Vern hadn't just skimmed profit, he had taken the only inheritance the Coopers could hand their sons and was about to sell it to strangers. Leela listened without interrupting, then wrote a short line in her notebook. Motive: protect legacy, respond to betrayal, under old local code. For the official file, she still had to use dry terms like land dispute, illegal alcohol, financial stress, and premeditated homicide. But the ledger on her desk filled those cold words with something sharper and harder to fit into law. In her mind, the 12 dead men became dots along a fence line on a map, tied not only by blood and marriage, but by a stolen recipe that moved from creek beds to contract drafts. If you look at it from the outside, you might say Wade chose murder over money. Inside his own frame, he chose violent, wrong, permanent protection over watching his family's one craft be copied and sold. Leela slid the ledger into a clear evidence bag, sealed the top, and wrote the date and case number on the strip of tape, locking Wade's explanation into the same chain that held his guns and jars that day. News of that ledger didn't stay inside office walls for long. In a small county, secrets leak faster than oil from an old truck. By the second night after the killings, word had already slipped from a deputy to a cousin to a man at the bar, then into the ears of a part-time reporter, and from there onto the air. WELKAM sat in a low brick building beside the feed mill, its tower blinking red over the dark fields. Inside, the studio smelled like coffee, dust, and warm wires. A fan ticked in the corner. On one wall, yellowed photos of gospel groups and high school teams curled at the edges. Buddy Lane, the evening host, slid on his headphones and glanced at the clock. 8 p.m. His call-in show usually covered high school ball and lost dogs. Tonight, every line blinked before he even opened the mic. A fresh copy of the Elkhorn Daily lay on the desk, headline shouting, "Ledger found in farm massacre. Recipe not fence at core, sources say." He cleared his throat, hit the switch, and leaned into the mic. He told listeners what the paper claimed, that Wade Cooper had left behind a handwritten list of names, that jars with those same names had been found by bodies along the fences, that this might have been about a stolen whiskey recipe passed down through generations. He didn't say where he'd heard some of it first. He just let the bare bones hang, then opened the lines. The first caller was an older woman from the far end of the county, voice thin but sharp. She said she'd known Wade as a boy, known Vern too, and that no matter what was taken, 12 dead men were 12 dead men. Shine is shine. You can't trade folks' lives for corn liquor. I don't care whose granddaddy wrote it. Next came a man who refused to give his name on air, though half the county would later swear they knew who it was by the sound. He spoke slow, like he was choosing each word with care. He said if what he'd heard was true, Vern hadn't just sold jars, he'd sold a family craft to outsiders and cut the original man out. Law don't see that as theft, but out here, you don't take a man's one skill and make him watch you get rich with it. Fence or no fence, that's a kind of killing on its own. Buddy let that hang a moment, then reached for the next blinking light. This voice shook a little. Ruth Ann had called from the back of the dispatch room on her break, headset laid on the desk beside her. She only gave her first name. She told listeners she was kin, one way or another, to both houses. She'd heard the fence calls. She'd seen the old raid slips with both surnames written on them. She said the law had always come down hard on the liquor itself, gallons, proof, tax, but never had a box to check when one man claimed another had stolen the know-how. "I'm not saying what Wade did was right," she added, voice tight. "I'm the one took that first call about screaming down old Jackson. I'll hear that in my sleep. But don't let nobody tell you this was just over a calf or a cut wire. There's more under it, and folk out here know that, whether they'll say it plain or not." A younger caller, his words fast and hot, broke through next. His daddy lay on one of those morgue gurneys. He spit hate at Wade, at the ledger, at talk of recipes. In his mind, this code was just an old man's excuse to grab glory in the ugliest way possible. You want to protect something, you write it down and lock it up. You don't shoot your neighbors and call it honor. For an hour, the voices rolled, some calling Wade a monster, some calling him broken but understandable, some blaming Vern for starting fires he couldn't put out, some blaming the system for never giving poor men any clean way to claim what was theirs. Over and over, certain words came back: name, legacy, fence, law, family. If you're hearing this now, think about what you would have said into that crackling phone line. Would you have called for the harshest punishment no matter the why? Or would you have found yourself saying, "I don't agree with what he did, but I understand what pushed him there"? Drop your own thoughts in the comments. This is where the story stops being distant and starts rubbing up against how you see right and wrong. By the time Buddy Lane signed off the air that night, folks in Elkhorn knew the rough shape of the story, even if the facts were still crooked. They went to bed talking about recipes and fences, about Wade and Vern, about what a man had to do and what he should never do. Next morning, heat rose early off the courthouse square. The red brick building sat heavy over Main Street, white columns catching the light. News trucks crowded the curb, dishes tilted toward the sky. Men in town caps leaned on truck hoods. Women in work scrubs stood in little knots, arms folded. It seemed like half the county had drifted in to see the man whose name lay on every tongue. A tan transport van rolled up beside the steps. Sheriff Earl climbed out first, face lined, hat low. 2 deputies opened the back doors. Chains clinked against metal. Wade Cooper stepped down onto the pavement, wearing county orange and shackles at his wrists and ankles. Cameras clicked fast. A TV reporter from Atlanta lifted a mic, hair perfect, eyes bright for the lead. To her, Wade was a headline, farm massacre suspect. To most watching, he was something harder to pin down: neighbor, kin, monster, or some mix. He walked straight, shoulders square, chin level. No sunglasses, no bowed head. The same hands that had fixed tractors and pulled calves now carried chain. In that small way, he still chose how the day would remember him. Not hunched, not dragged, but standing on his own feet. At the edge of the crowd, Ruth Ann watched, fingers tight on her purse strap. She'd heard his voice only over crackling phone lines and in old Christmas services. Now she saw the man whose choices had split her family tree. She could not tell if she wanted to spit or pray. Near her, 2 teens stood silent. Eli and Joel had been brought in a side door earlier for questioning, then released under watchful eyes. Eli's gaze locked on his father's back. Joel's jaw shook once, then clamped hard. Neither boy waved. Wade did not turn to look. He knew they were there. He didn't need to see their faces to feel the weight of them. On the top step, Agent Lila Grant waited with a clear evidence bag in her hand. Inside lay the copied ledger, Wade's neat block letters now framed in state tape. For cameras, that plastic pouch meant motive. For Wade, it was his last attempt at making anyone see how he understood what had happened. A reporter shouted a question as Wade reached the first stair. "Mr. Cooper, did you kill those 12 men over a whiskey recipe?" He paused, metal rattling, and glanced toward the sound. For a heartbeat, every noise in the square seemed to hush. He could have stayed silent, let lawyers speak later. He could have claimed madness or said nothing at all. "I answered what was taken. Y'all can write the rest however you want." To some ears, that sounded like cold confession. To others, it sounded like a man still living by a private rule book, even with the state's hand on his shoulder. Lila heard both at once. She knew those words would play on the 6 o'clock news, cut short, stripped of context, turned into one more sharp line in a story already swollen with them. The deputies moved him up the steps. Flashbulbs popped. A child in the crowd started crying. Someone muttered a curse. Someone else whispered a prayer for his soul. Above it all, the courthouse doors stood open, dark inside, waiting to swallow him. Walking through them, Wade felt the shift as clear as a weather change. Out past the square, in fields and along ditches, the code he'd lived by still ruled some hearts. You protect what's yours.
You don't run. You stand and take what comes. Inside these walls, a different set of rules held. Here, his ledger was evidence, not explanation. His jars were exhibits, not symbols. His answer was 12 counts of murder in first degree. Yet even as authority closed around him, his strategy was doing its work. Papers had printed the word recipe, radio callers argued over legacy, state agents had written protect name, legacy on their own forms. The thing he valued most, that old Cooper mash and what it meant, now sat at the center of every telling. That was his strange, tragic victory. He'd lost his freedom, lost any claim to moral safety, but he forced the world beyond Old Jackson Road to say out loud what had been stolen from him, even as they condemned the way he answered it. From here on, the story would pass from fence lines to courtrooms. If you stay with me, we'll step inside that next room together and watch how judges, lawyers, and 12 strangers weigh a ledger, some jars, and 12 dead men against the one word Wade kept coming back to: honor.
Inside the Elkhorn County courtroom, summer light slid through high panes and pooled on worn wood. Ceiling fans pushed warm air over benches packed with faces Wade had known his whole life. Under the faded state seal, the judge watched with tired eyes. The place smelled like dust, paper, and nerves. The case moved slow. 12 dead men meant 12 murder counts plus weapons charges. The state wanted to show pattern, not panic. The prosecutor, a sharp man from the city, rolled out a big map on an easel. Red pins marked each body along Old Jackson Road. Thin string linked them in order. He told the jury this was a planned route, not a fence fight that spun out of control. He called Dr. Hayes. The doctor spoke in simple terms about range, angle, and steady aim. No wild shots, no signs of struggle. Each wound hit almost the same spot in the chest or neck. Photo after photo glowed on a small screen. Wire fence in the background, boots in farm dirt, the same mix of peanuts, grass, and blood. Then Agent Lila Grant took the stand with the ledger in a clear bag. She held it so jurors could see the neat block print. She walked them through the pages, name by name, and showed how every man listed there now lay in the ground. Last, she read the bottom line aloud. When this is found, I'll have answered these names. To the prosecutor, that last sentence was a promise carried out. He called the ledger a manifesto. He said the jars at the scenes were calling cards, meant to make sure everyone understood who pulled the trigger and why. The defense tried to bend that same proof another way. Wade's lawyer, a worn man from 2 counties over, told the jury they were looking at someone raised under a hard code in a poor place. He spoke of Vietnam patrols, of old mountain law, of a mash recipe that was the only inheritance a small farmer could pass to his sons. He did not claim Wade was innocent. Wade would not allow it. When the lawyer hinted at words like shock or temporary madness, Wade shook his head at the table. In the break, he told him he knew what he'd done and would not hide behind sickness. So the defense shifted. It asked for mercy instead of a walk. It called Ruth Ann. She told the jury about calls to 911 over fences and guns that stayed minor on paper. She said she'd seen both names, Cooper and Hargrove, on old liquor raid files for years. In a low voice, she said the law had never had a line to mark theft of a craft, only the sale of the drink itself. Last, against advice, Wade took the stand. He spoke few words. He said Vern had been like a brother, then had sold what was not his to sell. He said the law had no box for that hurt, so he wrote his own. He did not ask for pity. When pressed, he said he wished the ledger alone had been enough and that he had not lifted a gun. When the jury went out, the room hummed. Some people glared at Wade with flat rage. Others watched him with something closer to grief. Hours later, the jurors filed back in. The foreman, a lean man with sunspots on his hands, stood and read their answer. They chose guilty on all counts, 12 life terms, his ledger and jars sealed into state record. Years slipped by after the verdict. State vans carried Wade north to a gray block of stone and razor wire 3 hours from Elkhorn. The sign out front named it in clean metal letters, but men inside just called it the Hill. Chain link, towers, and a double gate cut him off from fields, fences, and the cedar tree that had been his last free marker on Old Jackson Road. In that place, days stacked on days in a flat line. A buzzer woke the cell block before dawn. Guards counted heads. Doors clanged. Boots shuffled toward the chow hall. Wade ate, worked, slept, and lined up when told. He took an assignment in the furniture shop, sanding chair legs and tabletops until his fingers ached. Sawdust replaced farm dust. Fluorescent light replaced the sky. Time carved him thinner. Hair went to white, then to scalp. His back, already worn, bent more each year. Even so, he carried himself the same way he had on the courthouse steps, upright, quiet, eyes level. He never joined gangs, never gambled, never begged. Men in younger skin learned to read the warning in his calm and left him space. A small Bible sat on the shelf above his bunk. It came from the prison chaplain, who noticed how Wade's gaze slid past the TV in the day room and rested on nothing. Thin pages soon grew thick with penciled marks. He underlined every place that spoke of names, fathers, sons, and inheritance. In the back, he wrote a few lines in tiny letters, not about heaven or hell, but about what he had tried and failed to hold. Once a month, the chaplain sat on the edge of the steel stool in Wade's cell. He asked if Wade wanted to write a letter of apology to the families. He asked if he wished to say he'd been wrong. Wade would sit with hands on his knees and answer in the same low voice. He said he was sorry for the pain, sorry for the wives left with fields and no help. He also said the ledger still told the truth about what had been taken, even if the way he had answered it was sin. Back in Elkhorn, the Cooper farmhouse aged in place. Marie held it as long as she could, working a small job in town, renting acres to a neighbor. Deputies had searched every drawer and box after the arrests, bagging jars and notes as evidence, but they never found the metal case behind the calendar. When Marie moved out, years later, Eli pulled the warped sheetrock away and took the box with him. Inside lay the old recipe card, yellow and soft at the edges. He could have sold it or started his own run in some hidden patch, but every time he looked at those careful letters, he saw gurneys and grave markers. At the kitchen table in his tiny rental, he slid the card into a plain envelope and sealed it without reading the lines. That envelope went into a bank safe deposit box under his own name, not to be opened until after his death. Visits to the prison were rare because gas was high and the road felt long. When Eli and Joel did come, they sat at a gray plastic table while vending machines hummed. Talk stayed on work and health. No one spoke Vern's name or asked about MASH. In the yard, younger inmates whispered that Wade was the man who killed over a recipe. He refused to tell them more. The story had taken enough.
Long before Wade's hair went white on the hill, the people left behind had to learn how to walk through grocery aisles and school hallways with those names on their backs. In Elkhorn High's gym, 5 years after the massacre, the bleachers creaked under a small crowd. The school had put up a banner that read Community Healing Night in block letters, like a pep rally sign. Folding chairs ringed a circle at half court. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled of floor wax and coffee from big metal urns on a table.
At one end sat the Hargrove women. Vern's widow, Denise, wore a plain dress and kept her hands folded so tight her knuckles shone pale. On either side were sisters, in-laws, and a couple of teenage nieces. A boy with Vern's eyes slouched 2 rows up, hood pulled low. He'd started 9th grade hearing whispers, "That's the Hargrove kid." His last name drew looks in class and snickers in the locker room. Across the circle, Marie Cooper took a chair with Eli behind her. Her hair had gone grayer, thinner. She'd sold the farm a year before and rented a small place in town. People still greeted her at the post office, but some did it with eyes that slid away. Others hugged hard, as if to say they didn't hold her sins that weren't hers. Both responses stung. The school counselor opened the evening with soft words about grief and moving forward. Then he stepped back and let folks speak if they wished. For a while, no one moved. Chairs creaked, shoes shifted. Finally, Vern Hargrove stood. She didn't talk about Vern's deal or the recipe. She spoke about boots by the door that never got scuffed again, about bills she'd had to face alone, about boys who had to walk past that cedar tree every day and know their daddy died near there. She said nothing could balance 12 fresh graves, not paper, not pride, not an old card in a wall. When she sat, eyes shone around her, some with sympathy, some with old anger at Vern for setting the first match. Loss did not erase his choices, it only tangled them tighter. Marie stayed quiet until a teacher gently asked if anyone wanted to share from the other side. Everyone knew what that meant. After a long pause, she rose. She didn't defend Wade, she didn't call him a hero. She said he'd been a hard man who loved his sons and loved that recipe in that same fierce, narrow way. She told them about years of scraping through bad crops, about how jars paid for braces and tires, about how she'd watched his pride twist into something sharp when the Hargrove labels showed up. "I lost a husband twice," she said, voice flat. "Once when he chose that road, and again when the state locked him away. My boys lost their daddy and their name the same week." Across the gym, some of the Hargrove kin stared at the floor. They had their own double losses, a man to Wade's gun, and a family name now tied in county talk to theft and greed. Kids on their bus started using "pulling a Hargrove" as a joke for copying homework or taking credit that wasn't theirs. It was a small, cruel echo of what their uncle had done with the mash. Ruth Ann sat near the back, listening, hands wrapped around a foam cup. As dispatcher and cousin both ways, she felt every line of this knot. When the counselor invited her to speak, she only said that phones still rang over fences and money, that tempers still blew hot on Old Jackson Road, but now everyone measured their own anger against that night. Outside, in the dark parking lot, conversations split along old seams. Some Hargrove relatives whispered that the meeting was a trick to wring pity for the Coopers. Some Cooper supporters muttered that the Hargroves started it all and got what they deserved. A few people from neither line walked to their cars in silence, tired of taking sides. Children grew up inside these stories. One Hargrove boy dropped the family name when he turned 18 and moved 2 counties over, taking his mother's maiden name so job applications wouldn't snag on old headlines. A Cooper grandson in grade school punched another kid who called his granddaddy the recipe killer, and then had to sit in the principal's office while a faded newspaper clipping stared from the wall. For all of them, the massacre wasn't a chapter in a book. It was the reason an empty chair sat at Thanksgiving, the reason a father's tools rusted in a shed, the reason someone hesitated before saying their last name out loud. The ledger and jars had done their work. Everyone knew why Wade said he acted,
But knowing the why never softened the ache of birthdays without a father, unpaid mortgages, or kids who flinched at the sound of a rifle opening day of deer season. In family kitchens on both sides, the old word honor tasted different now, like something cracked and hard to chew, no matter which surname you carried.
Years rolled over Elkhorn like slow weather. Storefronts changed paint. Trucks changed model years. But the fields along Old Jackson Road stayed mostly the same. One chain grocery came and went 2 towns over. A bigger highway cut past the county line, yet Pine Ridge Baptist still held its dinners, and the cedar fence still marked the old Cooper-Hargrove line. Folks stopped saying Massacre every week, but no one forgot. A different sheriff wore the badge now. Mark Delaney had grown up 3 counties east, heard about the farm killings from a college roommate, then taken this job years later when Earl finally retired. On his first morning, he parked under the war statue on the courthouse lawn and looked up at the names carved there, thinking about how many more could have been added if one night in 1983 had spun even further out of control. Inside the sheriff's office, the big county map still covered the wall. Someone had peeled off the old raid photos and added new flyers about pills, meth, and stolen farm tools, but a thin red thread still traced Old Jackson Road. Mark asked Ruth Ann, now head dispatcher, for the Cooper file, and she pulled 2 thick boxes from the records room without needing to check the labels. He spent a long afternoon turning pages. Scene photographs had gone yellow at the edges, yet they still showed sharp. Bodies by wire, jars in grass, Wade's calm face under the cedar. The copied ledger lay near the top, Wade's careful print spelling out who had learned the mash and how it had spread. Stapled to the back was Agent Grant's note. Recipe theft appears central to offender's motive. No clear legal protection for such heritage. While Mark read, a fresh complaint slid across Ruth Ann's desk. 2 neighbors on the far side of the county had called within an hour of each other, both angry about a shared line, both hinting at taking care of it ourselves. Years earlier, those calls might have gone into the system as routine, a deputy sent later if time allowed. Remembering the photos in those boxes, Ruth Ann carried the new report straight into Mark's office. Instead of shrugging, he set the Massacre file beside the fresh printout. The 2 sets of papers, old and new, looked like pages from the same book. He told Ruth Ann to radio both men, tell them the sheriff himself was coming, then drove out with a senior deputy riding shotgun and the weight of 1983 sitting in the passenger seat with them. Out on a dusty lane, he found the 2 farmers nose to nose by a sagging stretch of wire, voices sharp, boots inches from the boundary. Rusty T-posts leaned, a fresh tire track cut across damp soil. Mark stepped between them before hands could twitch toward the rifles in their truck racks. He pointed at the metal line and, without naming Wade, told them exactly how fast anger over fences had once turned this county into a row of shrouds. Back at the square, he drafted a simple change in policy. Any call mentioning guns and boundaries would get a visit the same day from a supervisor, not just a paper form. At monthly trainings, he set the Cooper file on the table in front of young deputies, walked them through the jars, the ledger, the 13 case numbers, 12 dead and 1 locked away, and said, "This is what it costs when we treat just a fence fight like it's nothing." Over the next decade, nobody in Elkhorn turned a boundary quarrel into a massacre again. Arguments still flared over land and water, but deputies arrived faster, tempers cooled sooner, and men who reached for rifles met the steady memory of Wade's path laid out in those old photographs. Yet new storms rolled in. pills in lunchboxes, meth labs in trailers, foreclosures when big farms bought small ones. The system fixed the narrow gap Wade had crashed through, but it could not heal every wound sunk deep into the county's soil. Even so, his jars, his ledger, and the square of ground under that cedar had changed how the people with badges mapped danger. His story sat there in a file drawer, half warning and half sad lesson, reminding anyone who thumbed through it that ignoring slow insults and quiet thefts can let rage grow until the only language a broken man believes in is gunfire along a fence.
Out past Old Jackson Road, deeper than most folks ever walk now, the woods close in over a narrow path. Pine needles soften the sound of steps. Vines hang low. Somewhere ahead, the ground drops toward the creek where the old still once sat. Paper files and court words can tell one kind of story. This place tells another. The clearing is small and easy to miss. Trees have grown up where men once stood by the fire. The air smells of damp leaves and iron. Under a mat of briars, a rusted barrel leans on its side. A crushed copper coil curls out of the dirt like a dead snake. Brown glass from broken jars lies half buried, edges worn smooth by years of rain. This was where the first Cooper mash ran clear, long before Wade or Vern were born. Wade's grandfather hauled sacks of corn down this hill at night, careful with each step. In hard years, liquor from this spot bought coal, shoes, and seed. Churches held on, stores stayed open. Kids ate, in part, because clear liquor flowed out of this hollow and into quiet hands. On state books, all of that was crime. On family tables, it was how people stayed fed when prices and banks did not care what the soil had given. The law counted gallons, not stories. It saw still parts, not the empty plates they helped fill. That gap sat at the heart of Wade's anger. His sense that the only real thing he had to pass down had never been seen as worth guarding by anyone with a badge. Near the biggest pine, stones make a low, rough stack. Years ago, a hunter kicked one loose and found a wrapped bundle beneath. Wade's third ledger copy, the one meant for this hidden place. By then, the court case was done, so the book just went into the same thick file as the others. The hollow lost its secret and went back to silence. Look around here long enough, and a picture forms. You see how much skill lived in these trees, knowing water levels, fire heat, the right scent of clean shine. None of that ever sat in a classroom. It moved from hand to hand, from eye to eye, the way songs and stories do. That is the kind of legacy that leaves no deed, no patent, nothing a judge can point to and say, "This is yours and no one may take it." Wade tried to force that claim into the open by turning this craft into a message. His jars, his notes, his choice to leave a ledger under a stone turned the still from a worksite into a kind of shrine and confession. He used the tools of his world, glass, ink, land, to shout a truth he thought no one would hear any other way. In doing it, he burned the very thing he was trying to save. Stand here, and you can feel all three failures at once. Vern's hunger to turn a shared recipe into fast money, Wade's choice to meet that theft with bullets instead of words on a clean page, the state's long habit of caring more about tax on jars than about the deep fear of erasure that lived in men like Wade. Three forces, all blind in their own ways, met at these fence lines and ended with 12 covered bodies. There is nothing noble about those bodies. No old code, no proud talk of honor puts breath back into a man or a father at his child's ball game. Yet it would be easy, too easy, to say the answer is to forget that honor and legacy ever mattered. Out here, they still do. A name on a stone, a story told at Sunday supper, a recipe card locked in a box. These small things hold people up when paychecks and courts fall short.
So the hard question hangs in the damp air over this dead still. How do you protect what cannot be weighed or taxed, respect, craft, memory, without turning guns on your own neighbors? Wade answered wrong in the worst way a person can. Vern answered wrong in a quieter way that still killed. The law answered late and only after the ground drank blood. When you walk back up the hill, leaves brushing your legs, the sound of the creek fades. Trucks on the highway hum far off. Somewhere in a dark bank box, the Cooper recipe card still waits, its letters clear. It carries a legacy that may never boil again, and maybe that is its last strange mercy. A craft saved on paper, but taken out of the reach of men who might kill or die over its taste. When the path leaves the trees, you step out beside a two-lane highway that cuts past Old Jackson Road. Trucks push wind and dust as they roar by, heading toward other towns, other troubles. On the right shoulder stands a brown metal sign, easy to miss unless you already know to look. Road crews repaint it when it fades, but they always bolt it back into the same scar in the dirt. At the top, white letters spell Elkhorn Farm Tragedy, 1983. Under that, a tight block of text does the rest. 12 killed on nearby farms, victims from 3 related families. Shooter, local farmer Wade Lee Cooper, surrendered at scene. Motive linked to dispute over land and illicit whiskey. That is the whole story the state gives to strangers. A short list of numbers and nouns. No ledger, no recipe card, no jars laid on fences, no word like honor or betrayal anywhere on the paint. Down in Elkhorn, the story can't stay that small. Ruth Ann still works the radios, though she trains younger voices to take the worst calls. Her hair is silver now. In the bottom drawer of her desk lies the old mass casualty sheet from that night, edges soft, ink dim. Some evenings, when the room falls quiet, she opens it, touches the date, and closes it again. The Hargrove clan walks under a name that never quite washed clean. Vern is long in the ground, but people still lower their voices when they say what he did with that mash. His widow rings up bread and canned beans at a tiny store off the highway. Her oldest boy, who kept the surname, coaches youth ball and tells kids that bragging about stolen work is a good way to lose more than you gain. The Cooper sons carry a different weight. Eli keeps the house lights on with plant wages and pays a small fee to guard a safe deposit box downtown. Inside it sits the stained recipe card his father once bolted into a wall. He never boils the mash written there. When his children ask about Wade, he tells them only that their grandfather loved hard, worked hard, and chose the worst answer a man can choose. Joel moved closer to the coast, took a hammer job, and learned that outside this county, Cooper can just be ink on a pay stub. On long drives, if a late-night host brings up the farm massacre, he changes stations before the fence lines in his mind light up. Wade's own line ended far from soil. Years after the trial, in a prison infirmary 3 hours north, his lungs failed and his heart eased to a stop. A guard found him lying straight on his bunk, Bible open by one hand. The chaplain sent a thin letter back to Elkhorn. No cameras, no last speech, no chance to polish or excuse. The man who had turned jars and ink into weapons of message left the world the way most poor prisoners do, quiet, known only to a file and a small circle of worn faces at home. Back by the roadside marker, the land keeps turning without him. New owners cut hay where peanuts once grew. The cedar at the old Cooper Hargrove fence stands taller, bark rough and scarred only by weather now. Cows graze in its shade, hooves pressing into ground that once soaked up blood and glass. They do not know the names that lie under their pasture, or the taste that men once killed over in these ditches. If you stand by that sign and read slow, you hold two stories at once. One is that neat state line about land, whiskey, and a shooter. The other is the longer, darker tale you've walked through here. A poor farmer afraid his family's only legacy would be stolen and sold. A neighbor who treated shared skill like cash on a table. And a legal system that knew how to jail men for gallons, but not how to guard a handmade craft. So I'll leave it with you. When you think about Wade Cooper now, is he just a murderer in orange, or also a man trapped inside a broken code and a thin set of choices? How much is a name, a recipe, a story really worth? And where would you have drawn the line on Old Jackson Road? Share your answer in the comments, and if you want more stories told this way, hit subscribe before you move on.